In this episode of Restore It, it's finally time to fully rebuild the Mercedes W123 280 CE Coupe. I know, I can't quite believe it myself, I'm actually going to finish a car restoration. Well, part restoration. This project was never meant to be a full restoration, or anything close to one. The original work planned was for 4 rust spots to be repaired, 1 in each lower corner of the car, repaint the car along with the engine bay, and polish the trim. That was it. If that was all of the work needed, I'm almost certain it would have been done within the 5 months agreed. As we all know, plans change, things come up, and things don't always go how we'd like them to. So once I started taking bits off and having a really good look at the car, it was clear I had a lot more work to do than I first thought. In hindsight, of course I did. And so along with making episodes for YouTube and working on other projects at the same time, 5 months went by in a blink of an eye, and here we are 2 years later, almost ready to hand the keys back. It's a bit shameful really, but I've learned so much taking this on, and those lessons will stick with me forever. And now I can't wait to really crack on with the 325i Sport, knowing what I now know after this small nightmare. I'm going to get into why I really shouldn't have taken this project on in the first place during this episode, but first, to mark the occasion of this Mercedes exiting my life for good, I'm going to consume the entirety of today's sponsor, Shaker & Spoon. Shaker & Spoon is a monthly cocktail subscription box that sends you ingredients to make craft cocktails at home, or in my case, at work. Each month you'll get a box that's centered around one spirit. I went for the vodka brunch and fruits of fall boxes. In each box there are recipes and ingredients to make 3 different cocktails, and each recipe makes 4 drinks. That's 12 cocktails per box, and you get to bring your favourite spirits. To try these out, I used some vodka that I had on hand to make the Weekender cocktail. I applied the seasoning to the rim of the glass as instructed, then added the Bloody Mary mix, the garden infused vinegar medley, and finally the Kim chili sauce that I got from Shaker & Spoon. I mixed it up and poured it over some crushed ice, and it was actually really nice, as were the other 7 cocktails. And yes, I've tried them all. These boxes couldn't have come at a more appropriate time. So to give this a try, click the link in the description and use code RESTORE at checkout, or go to shakerandspoon.com/restore to get $20 off your first box. These boxes are a great gift for someone who loves cocktails, or just a great way to entertain some friends who also like cocktails. That's shakerandspoon.com/restore, or click the link below and use code RESTORE for $20 off your first box. Big thanks to Shaker & Spoon for helping me celebrate. So getting back to it, I first had to remove the masking tape and paper that was used for the full respray. Because I was now working towards a new deadline, and because I wanted this car out of my workshop just as much as the owner did, I asked my friend Scott from Smith's Cars to come in and help me with some of the 2-man jobs involved in this rebuild. But if I'm being honest, he did more than his fair share, and I can't thank him enough. So if you're looking for a decent second-hand car in the UK, I'll leave his link down below. I just want to quickly mention that some of the footage is missing from this episode due to a lack of time. I simply didn't have the time to film everything in detail like I'm used to. The E30 episodes are going to be way more detailed than what you're about to see. I just wanted to put that out there. Whilst we get started at the rear end, I want to talk about why I shouldn't have taken this project on, or at least why I shouldn't have let it get so out of hand and instead stuck to the original plan. In the beginning, a few people left comments warning me that some of the parts for these cars are super rare or impossible to get hold of. I didn't think that much of it at the time, as in the past I've been quite good at finding NLA or rare parts, and I knew in the back of my mind that Mercedes keeps parts for their cars 40 years after production ends. One thing I didn't know when I took this car on is that the coupes make up only 5% of the production of W123s, which means some of the parts which were specifically designed for the coupe are just as, if not more rare than the cars themselves. Brilliant. During the rebuild, I've been speaking with the #1 W123 guru from W123 World, Mark Kosovich. This man knows literally everything there is to know about W123s. One day I hope to have as much knowledge on E30s as he has on these. He currently has 27 left and right hand drive W123s in his workshop, and he ships them to customers globally. With the boot lining in, the rear of the car is now pretty much done besides the rear glass. Up next, we moved on to the dashboard, interior and windows. Anyway, to my surprise, Mark told me he stopped restoring coupes about 3 years ago as the parts are just not available. He's even gone to the extent of having a company make OE engine oil coolers because they're becoming that hard to find. I just want to say thanks to Mark for the help down the phone, and hopefully one day I'll pop into the workshop and see how it's all done properly. So let's just think about this for a second. For my first ever customer car, I've taken on a W123 model that the #1 W123 guru in the world wouldn't restore. Now I know I've only got myself to blame, but that's why I've been so busy recently trying to sort out so many different issues and in some cases failing miserably. I just can't get parts that no longer exist. Another big mistake I made was not properly assessing the damage and changing the quote to reflect the work required. And oh boy, was there a lot of work. In total there were 20 separate rust spots around the car that needed major work before I could even think about the respray. The differential and drive shafts have been rebuilt, the engine bay was way worse than we first thought, so a lot of rust removal had to be done. The underside of the car has been derusted and fresh undercoating has been applied, the underside parts have been cleaned up and re-protected, the engine has had a deep clean and general service, all of the chrome trim has been polished and the car has been fully repainted. Not a full restoration, but not a small job either. I almost feel as if the car should have been fully stripped and dipped or blasted, but that really is a totally different league to what most people can afford or are willing to wait for, which is fair enough. So that's why I'm going to be sticking to my own cars for now and focus on customer car parts and antiques instead. Having this Mercedes so close to being finished is making me super excited to start rebuilding the 325i Sport once all of its welding is done. I've learnt so much rebuilding this car. Every cloud does have a silver lining, I guess. I think one day I'll start taking on other people's cars again, but I'll be sticking with old BMWs as that's what I really love working on. With the dashboard, passenger side interior trim and window glass in, I was about to install the parcel shelf when I realised it was purple from sun damage. It should be as dark as the edge you can see here. Luckily I had some fabric dye on hand. It's a little bit lighter than it should be, but it's definitely better than purple. I think this really needs to be reupholstered with some fresh fabric to complete the look. I just don't have the time. After cleaning it as best as I could, I sprayed the dye on and rubbed it in with a cloth. Once it was dry, I cleaned the area of dust and installed it along with the rear speakers and first aid kit. Whilst I was doing that, the centre console and some of the driver's side bits have been installed by Scott off camera. If you can remember all the way back to the second episode, I discovered this door locking thing had a rounded screw in it. It's little bits like this that have caught up with me during this rebuild. Everything needs to be fixed, cleaned or repainted before it can be fitted, and it's always way more time consuming than I think it's going to be, by a long shot. With that done, I can now start rebuilding the interior side of the doors. Another thing Mark told me from W123 World is that W123s and especially W123 coupes have notoriously unreliable window regulating systems. The glass is very heavy and they only work well when fully serviced with new or good guides that have been well lubricated. He also mentioned, and I quote, that the rear windows are a bit of a nightmare to restore and get working correctly. And just to give you an idea of how stressful this has been at times, I spent the best part of 3 days trying to get all 4 windows working correctly. I didn't get new guides, I just thoroughly cleaned and re-greased all of them, but due to the age of the components, they just don't feel as factory fresh as you'd like them to. Whilst that was going on, we got the rear seats in, some of the interior trim, and started experimenting with the outer trims to try and get them to fit correctly. The rear windows really were a pain. I make it look easy in this episode, but it truly was a painful experience, especially having a limited time to do it. Once I was happy enough, I could then add the door cards and all of their bits back in. There was a lot of this kind of thing not caught on camera. Fitting a load of parts to then realise a piece you've just found was meant to go in first or second, so it all comes back off again just for one piece. Here's another great example. I had almost everything on this door card apart from this end piece, and there was no way I could make it fit. I had to remove everything and instead start with this piece and go from there. One thing I didn't really film was some welding that took place on the upper driver's side footwell. It meant that the throttle pedal assembly had to be removed, as well as all of the trim and carpet around it. With that all sorted and back in, I could then fit the driver's seat. That's pretty much the interior sorted. The dash and centre console have been hooked up, and we'll find out how well we did when we connect the battery. With the interior behind us, I quickly installed the heat shields that run along the underside in preparation for the engine and exhaust. I gave each of these a blast and a repaint off camera to save time. Ignore the engine and gearbox you can see there. It seems the time warp continuum has shifted for this final heat shield. Back to reality, I started fitting all of the various covers and mounts to the engine bay whilst I still had a lot of room to play with. And finally, I installed the prop shaft ready to be connected to the gearbox. Before I could install the engine and gearbox, I had to first reattach all of the bits I took off to restore or replace, starting with the starter motor. There was a lot more involved than what you've just seen, but you get the idea. All of the ancillaries were attached, belts tensioned, spark plugs and filters changed, and the engine wrapped up ready for lifting. Once it was on the lift, I dragged it over to the engine bay and jacked the rear of the car up using the car lift. I feel like the gearbox is quite small compared to the engine, which is good because it makes getting it back in quite easy. Slowly but surely I brought the two together and started to undo the opposing angle that I started with at the beginning. It was at this point that it started to get a bit tricky. Lots of faffing and perseverance is needed to install an engine like this. I've often wondered what it would be like removing and installing the engine from underneath and lifting the chassis away instead. I think I'll have to try it on an E30 next time I do it. Towards the end, I had a jack supporting the rear of the gearbox in such a way that it allowed me to move it forwards and backwards as needed. Once it was super close, I removed the leveller and had it supported only from the front eyelet and the jack underneath the rear of the gearbox. With a bit more wiggling and general faffing, it was in place and I had the engine mounts finger tight. Considering I did that on my own, it actually went very well. It took me about 2 hours or so, but I got there in the end. I could then tighten the engine and gearbox mounts and engine struts. With that sorted, I took a break from the car itself and got to work cleaning the windscreen rubbers. The insides of these rubbers were filled with old hard sealant and had to be absolutely clean before reinstalling them onto the glass. I used Genelite's glue and tar remover to make this job a lot easier than it would have been without it. I cleaned the outsides and then used a blunt knife to pick out all of the old sealant. With both of those now super clean, I turned my attention to the headliner above the rear windscreen. It needed to be stuck down and held tightly in place before the glass can go in. I used contact adhesive on a brush to make both sides tacky before sticking it down and using tape to hold it in place. To make absolute sure everything stayed where I wanted it, I used these small but strong clamps along the entirety of the lip. I gave both windscreens a good clean off camera and they were now ready for their rubbers to go back on. I'm going to have the windscreens themselves installed by professionals on the final episode, which is coming up next on the channel not long after this one. With both windscreens ready to be installed, I put them to one side and got to work on installing the side trims. It turns out the best and possibly only way to install these trims is to insert the red clips first, push them fully into the car and then align the trim up and give it a good slap to make it snap into place. The rear and middle pieces both have screws to hold one side in. I didn't show it, but all of these were added as well. Moving back to the engine bay, we started fitting things like the throttle cable mount, the diagnostic plug mount and the engine fan. Up next were the headlights, the washer motors and the indicators. But as this front wing is a pattern part, the hole for the wiper motor isn't there, so I had to drill one. This is only the beginning of the trouble this pattern wing caused me. We'll come back to it soon. Moving on, the bumper rubbers were added before the front bumper itself went on, followed by some of the lower front trim. Up next was the bonnet latch and cable setup, followed by the front grille and an engine bay weather strip. With all of this progress made, I started at the back working forwards, making sure everything was torqued to specification. Once that was done, we added the side window trims. These needed to be screwed and sealed in place. These were then followed by the main weather strip, which took absolutely ages to reattach, at least 100 times longer than it took to remove it. So going back to this front wing, would you believe it? The indicator does not fit. It absolutely will not go in there, especially when it's plugged into the headlight correctly. I spent at least half a day trying to get the bloody thing anywhere close to fitting. I tried everything to the point of destroying the lip where the indicator sits. So I spoke to the owner and we both agreed a second-hand, rust-free, genuine wing would be the best bet. That wing has now arrived and is about to be painted. You'll see that go on in the final episode of this series, which is coming up later this month. I'm super happy with the progress Scott and I made. I just didn't have enough time to get absolutely everything ready so we could turn the key and have it drive out this episode, but it won't be long now. One more episode that's coming up at the end of this month, and that's the Mercedes done. I think I'll definitely need a few more Shaker and Spoon subscription boxes to celebrate. So that's all we've got time for this week. Thanks so much for joining me, and I hope to see you in the next one. Cheers.